Mr. President, I rise in support of the National Defense Authorization Act. And I rise in support to move this bill forward and the amendments that many of us in this body want to have heard, debated, and voted on. And I also rise in opposition to obstruction to this bill, obstruction to the key issues of national defense for our country. And make no mistake, Mr. President, there is obstruction going on the Senate floor right now with regard to this important bill. A little bit of background here. This bill, the NDAA, came out of the Senate Armed Services Committee after a lot of hard work, bipartisan work, by all the members of the committee. We worked together to include over 185 amendments. Almost all of these were bipartisan amendments. My colleagues on the other side of the aisle talked about voting against the bill because they didn't like the way it was funded, even though our committee had nothing to do with the funding. But at the end of the day, after much debate in the committee, we worked past a strong, important, reform-oriented, bipartisan NDAA by a vote of 22-4. That is bipartisanship. I want to thank the chairman of that committee, Senator McCain, the ranking member, Senator Reid, on their great leadership on getting this committee to work so closely together to move the bill forward. I had the distinct honor of traveling with both of them just 2 weeks ago as part of the Armed Services Committee to Vietnam and to Singapore for an important defense ministry conference. And it was a huge honor for me as a new member of this body to travel with John McCain, Jack Reed, two veterans who have sacrificed a lot for their country, to Vietnam and other places. They did a fantastic job on this bill. Then this bill came to the floor, and it all stopped. Everything came to a halt. There are over 500 amendments of senators who want to move forward on a bipartisan basis to try to improve this bill. We have gotten to barely a trickle. Barely a trickle. Nothing's happening. For 2 weeks we've been on this bill. Nothing's happening. After the great work that we did in the Senate Armed Services Committee. So what's going on here, Mr. President? It's the same obstructionist playbook that my colleagues, and particularly the minority leader, used for the last few years. And the American people have rejected it. They rejected it last November. They rejected it when they realized that this body heard 14 amendments, roll call votes, 14 amendments in the entire year of 2014. That's not how this body is supposed to work. Nobody on either side of the aisle wants this to work. But it's certainly not how it's supposed to work when it comes to the defense of our nation, when it comes to the critical bill to take care of our men and women in uniform. And yet, the minority leader said, this bill is a waste of time. Let me repeat that. The National Defense Authorization Act, one of the most important things we do in this body, is a, quote, a waste of time. Mr. President, I understand that we have ideological differences in the parties. That's certainly the way it should be. That's the way it's been since the founding of our great nation. But if leaders on the other side of the aisle believe that protecting the country, taking care of the men and women in uniform, and keeping our promises to them is a waste of time, then we don't belong to different parties. We belong in different universes. In this world, in this universe, in the U.S. Senate, our most important job is to protect this country and to take care of the men and women who so courageously serve our country. It's not a waste of time to be doing that. It's the most important thing we are sent here to do. We took an oath. We pledge to solemnly swear to defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. That's what this bill does. And that's what we, members on both sides, are trying to do in terms of improving it with amendments. But none of those are moving. None of those are moving. And that's a shame. Mr. President, one of the things that we tried to address in the bill are the serious threats and challenges that our nation faces. In Senate Armed Services Committee hearing that we had several weeks ago, former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger said, quote, "The United States has not faced a more diverse and complex array of crises since the end of World War II. We know what they are: the growth and brutality of ISIS, a rising China, Iran on the verge of obtaining a nuclear weapon, the largest state sponsor of terrorism, possibly on the verge of gaining a nuclear weapon, and a resurgent Russia that's invaded the sovereign territory of another country, first time since World War II, in the heart of Europe. So at this time, we not only have obstruction on the other side of the aisle from the leader there, the President of the United States is threatening to veto the NDAA. I'm not sure they're reading what's going on in the world. I'm not sure they recognize the critical importance of this bill. And to threaten to veto this bill, and therefore what, we're going to stop? No, we're going to do our duty. And we'll put this on the President's desk, and we'll see if he vetoes it when the United States faces this huge array of challenges. Let me talk about one of those challenges, Mr. President, for a few minutes. It's an important area, it's certainly an important area for me as a senator from Alaska. It's the Arctic and the increasing militarization of the Arctic by Russia. Earlier this year, Russia began a 5-day Arctic war exercise that included 38,000 troops, 50 surface warships, in addition to submarines, and 110 aircraft in the Arctic. And the Russians are not being shy about their ambitions in the Arctic. President Putin has said that he wants to build 13 new airfields in the Arctic. He wants to add 4 new combat brigades, Russian combat brigades, in the Arctic. He is going to stand up a new Arctic command, and he's going to add several new icebreakers to their already robust fleet. The chairman of the Armed Services Committee, in testimony in front of the Senate Armed Services, talked about this. Talked about what the Russians are doing in the Arctic. There's no mystery here. As a matter of fact, Mr. President, today there was an outstanding article in the Wall Street Journal entitled, "The New Cold War's Arctic Front." Subtitle, "Putin is militarizing one of the world's coldest, most remote regions." Well, to my state, this is home. America is an Arctic nation because of Alaska. Mr. President, I'd like to submit this article for the record, please.
Without objection.
The writer in this article talks about what's at stake, talks about what the Russians are doing in the Arctic. Here's a map. It's a little small, but it shows Russia's Arctic push and the dramatic increase in air bases, operational infrastructure, all around the Arctic, and the different exercises. And we know that it's an important place. Transportation, natural resources. This is a critical area. Our leaders are taking notice, our military leaders. The U.S. Northcom commander, Admiral Bill Gortney, stated, quote, "Russian heavy bombers flew more out-of-area patrols in 2014 than in any time since the Cold War." Secretary of Defense Carter just 2 months ago said the Arctic is going to be a major area of importance to the United States, both strategically and economically in the future. And it's fair to say that we're late to that recognition. But, Mr. President, this is why the NDAA is so important. Congress heard this testimony. Senate Armed Services heard this testimony. We've been following what's happening in the Arctic, and we've acted. So the NDAA has provisions to start to address the challenges that we see in the Arctic. It certainly is focused on making sure that the Arctic remains a peaceful and stable place. But it also starts to focus the leadership of our military on the Arctic, and that's important. There's language in the NDAA, unanimously voted on in the committee, very bipartisan, that requires the Secretary of Defense to submit a report that updates the U.S. military strategy in the Arctic and requires a military operations plan to be described for the protection and security of our interests in the Arctic, and to lay out what the issues are, what the threats are, what the Russians are doing in the Arctic. Certainly, President Putin is going to be watching, and maybe he's taking notice that we're noticing, and that's one reason why this is an important bill. But, as you see here, the Wall Street Journal article today talked about President Putin moving forward, possibly having the ability to send airborne troops, airborne brigades to the Arctic. And yet right now, our own U.S. Army is thinking about removing the only airborne brigade in the Arctic. That's not good strategy, Mr. President. That's why we need this bill, to set the direction in terms of strategy, to make sure we're not making strategic mistakes as the Russians move forward in the Arctic and we start looking at reducing our capabilities there. Weakness is provocative. And if anyone knows that, it's President Putin. We need to show strength. And that's why we need to pass this bill. Mr. President, finally, I just want to talk briefly about an amendment that I wanted to offer. I'm still trying to get offered as part of the NDAA. As I mentioned, there's a lineup of hundreds of amendments. Unfortunately, the leader on the other side of the aisle doesn't want to move them. This is one of those amendments. It's a very bipartisan amendment. If it were allowed to come to the floor, it would probably pass overwhelmingly. It's a simple amendment. All it does is ask the President to follow the law when it comes to raising the pay of members of our military. Simple amendment. The law states that our service members are entitled to get a larger pay increase, not much, but when there's a pay increase, a slightly larger pay increase than their civilian counterparts. That's the law. That's the current law. And my amendment expresses the sense of the Senate that when giving a pay increase to members of the Department of Defense, military and civilian, that the President simply needs to follow the law. Now, I want to emphasize something. As somebody who served in the military, still serving in the reserves, our civilian DOD employees and members do a superb job. They're patriotic. They work hard. They deeply respect the members of the military with whom they serve. I've seen this in my entire career. The law, the current law, however, recognizes the unique sacrifices that our service members make wearing the uniform of our country and mandates a 0.5% greater pay increase when there is a pay increase for our men and women in uniform. Right now, the President is not abiding by that law. Simple. He needs to do it. My amendment would request and focus on this issue, and I think we could probably get 100 senators voting for it. So what's the origin of this law and the intent behind it? Simple. It recognizes the unique sacrifices our men and women in the military make. These sacrifices are well known to the American people. They include long hours. They include serious, difficult separations from family. Of course, they include the risks of combat when our troops are deployed overseas in combat zones. It includes hardship to families when our troops are deployed. You miss weddings, birthdays, first communions. And it takes into account even training. Because the members of the military don't work on a 9-to-5 basis. Let me give you one example, Mr. President. I had the great opportunity to head out to the National Training Center in California. Fort Irwin, one of the great training bases in our country, one of the great training places in the world, to watch the training of Fairbanks, Alaska-based 1st Stryker Brigade. They were out there for a month deployment, training hard. They weren't punching a clock 9 to 5. They were training around the clock, every day. I happened to be out there on Super Bowl Sunday. Super Bowl Sunday. The vast majority of Americans were enjoying the Super Bowl, as they should have been. Having fun, going to parties, watching the game, drinking Coke, Pepsi, a little beer. But there were some Americans who were out in the middle of Fort Irwin in the desert training. They weren't watching the Super Bowl. They were training to make sure when their country next called them up, they would be ready to protect our nation. That's the reason this law states that we treat our military members a little bit different than other members of the Department of Defense. It's all my amendment would do, Mr. President, but unfortunately, this one, like dozens, if not hundreds, is not going to be heard, at least for the time being, because the other side, the minority leader, is trying to bring back the way they used to run the Senate last year and the year before, and the year before that. We know, we've heard the stories. Last year, again, 14 amendments brought to the floor for a roll call vote in 2014, essentially shutting down the greatest deliberative body in the world. We've heard the stories of how the previous majority leader used his position to block consideration of amendments more than twice as often as the previous 6 majority leaders combined. And now we're doing it on a bill that relates to the national security of our nation and the critical issue of taking care of the men and women in uniform. Mr. President, I hope we can move through this. I hope when we get to regular order, I hope that this body can take up amendments like mine, common sense, bipartisan amendments that are going to keep our nation safer, take care of our troops and their families, and give the American people faith that we're doing the job that they sent us here to do. That's my hope. We're already doing it under the new majority leader. We voted on almost 200 amendments already this year, but right now we're stuck on one of the most important bills this body will consider in the entire year. And it's a shame, and we need to get unstuck. Mr. President, I yield the floor.